the title of my paper is Projecting Indian Myths, Culture and History onto Tolkien's Worlds. So as you know, Tolkien has a huge universe within his works, and Indian myths are huge. They are the biggest, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These are the two main epics of India, and the Mahabharata is the longest epic in the world, epic poem. So yes, there was a lot of ground to cover. I'll be touching on just the surface of what I think can be compared between the Indian epics and Tolkien's worlds. I'd like to just say that this is my interpretation of Tolkien's works, and people are free to either agree or disagree with me. And so I'll start. So while Tolkien was admittedly influenced by various European myths, was he also unconsciously perhaps affected by Indian myths too? Because certain parallels can be drawn between specific points of Indian myths and Tolkien's works. So Tolkien must have had some knowledge of ancient Indian texts, but neither the extent of his familiarity with them nor their influence upon his writing is clear. So the comparisons presented in this paper are suppositions and suggestions. So I'll mention something I've mentioned before at Leeds. For example, the word Iluvatar has connotations of the Sanskrit word avatar or incarnation. So loosely translated, one of the interpretations of Iluvatar could be avatar of light. And Urdu is another major language of India and is an amalgam of Hindi, the national language, and which is derived from Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. So the word Ainur has the connotation of Aina or mirror and Nur or light. Therefore, one interpretation from an Indian perspective could be a mirror of light that is possibly the Ainur mirrored back Iluvatar's light, or they, so that he could know himself through them. So this is one possible interpretation. And then the Hindu Trinity is composed of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Brahma is the main god. He is asleep and dreaming, and our world is a manifestation of his dream. So since Iluvatar created Tolkien's fictional world through his music and through his mind, can Iluvatar be identified with Brahma to a certain extent? Then Vishnu is supposed to be the preserver, and one could see this quality in Manwe as well. So, so other parallels have been drawn by other researchers and even anonymous bloggers on the internet, but I will only explore certain aspects that time will permit in this paper. So I will just quickly mention Mark T. Hooker, who published Tolkien and Sanskrit in 2016, where he mainly explored a particular series of perceived onomastic and geographical links between the Indus River watershed and the Sapta Sandhu, or the 7 mythical rivers of India, and Tolkien's legendary Beleriand. But Hooker's research was criticized by Nelson Goring in the 2016 Journal of Tolkien Research, Volume 3, Issue 3. And so Nelson said, there is not the slightest shred of evidence that Tolkien ever sat down and read stretches of the Rig Veda or the Mahabharata, or even of the excerpts in Thumb's handbook, or that he would even have been capable of doing so without considerable further study of the language. So yeah, maybe there are other scholars who have talked about Tolkien and Sanskrit, but I don't have the time to mention them here. So the Ramayana and the Mahabharat are two major myths of India with long and convoluted plot lines with hundreds, if not thousands, of characters, and sometimes gods, goddesses, and other worldly beings mingle with humans on earth. Does that sound familiar to you? So there are various views as to the period during which these texts were written. I will not really go into it in this paper, because people have different views depending on, like Indian scholars have a different view from European scholars. So the Ramayana, but let's say the Ramayana was written around the 5th century BC. And it was written by the sage Valmiki, and the Mahabharata was written by the sage Vyas. And Vyas is also a character in the epic poem Mahabharata. And of course, there are many, many versions of Ramayana, and there are translations in many Indian languages. It is also a popular text in Southeast Asia as well. And the tales of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are taught in schools, and they permeate popular culture. There are countless books for all ages, graphic novels, TV series, films. And it's worthwhile mentioning that Hinduism is practiced widely as a religion in India in almost every city, town, and village. And so the gods and deities mentioned in these stories are worshipped to this day. And therefore, usually I should say, I should either add Shri before the name of the deity or JIG to show respect. But because I have limited time, I might not do that, but I don't mean any disrespect to these beings. So let's start with cosmic connotations. So both the Indian myths and Tolkien's works have cosmic connotations. So elves travel in mysterious ships to the distant undying lands from Middle Earth and then back to Middle Earth. And in the Indian myths, you have vimanas, V-I-M-A-N-S, or flying palaces or vehicles, which are mentioned in ancient Indian texts. One example is the Pushpak Vimana, which was made by Vishvakarma for the god Brahma. The god Brahma gave it to his brother, to Kubera, the god of wealth. And later on, the half-brother Ravan. Ravan is the main villain of Ramayana. He stole it, and then later on, Lord Rama, who is the protagonist of the Ramayana, was able to ride in it. So the stars where the Valar have their abode are described as heavenly. I don't need to describe it, you probably know it from the books. And of course, also the abode of Lord Vishnu, for example, called the Vaikuntha or Vishnu Lok. So in Hindu mythology, there are 7 upper lokas or spheres, and they are imperishable and they are heaven-like. And there are 7 lower lokas where the demons, etc. live. Then almost all the Hindu gods are involved in one way or the other in the 2 Indian epics. Just for example, in the Greco-Roman myths. In fact, a lot of myths from all over the world have many, many common elements and similarities. And in Tolkien's sub-created myths, the Valar work from behind the scenes and in worldly affairs, and some of the Maya are directly involved in worldly affairs. So my next subtitle is Earth as a chessboard of the immortals. So in the Ramayana, it's supposed that Lord Rama was an incarnation of Vishnu. Remember, Vishnu was one of the 3 main gods. And he came to Earth to defeat Ravana, who is the main villain of this story. So Vishnu had to take on a mortal form in order to defeat the demon Ravana, who lived in Lanka. And it is supposed that this is Sri Lanka, south of India. So in Tolkien's Middle-earth saga, the main conflict is between the Valar and Morgoth, and then later Sauron. So the Valar tend not to take part directly in these wars in Middle-earth, but the elves, demi-mortals, mortals, and some of the Maya, including the wizards, are used almost like pawns to fight in this long, ongoing war. Though the mortals fight willingly enough, it's not really their responsibility to fight and overcome a supernatural enemy such as Sauron. So I will now talk about the marriages between mortals and immortals. So in the Ramayana, Ram married Sita, who was supposedly a mortal woman at the beginning of the story. But at the end of the story, in some versions, she is the goddess Lakshmi in mortal form, because there are different versions of these myths. So if we suppose that Sita was a mortal woman, then this would be a marriage between a man with immortal lineage, who is Lord Ram, and a mortal woman. And as you know, in Tolkien's universe, there were 3 marriages between elvish women who considerably longer lives than their mortal husbands. I will not mention the 3 marriages because most of you probably know about them. Also in the Mahabharat, Kunti, who was the wife of Pandav, who is one of the main protagonists, had sons from 6 different gods. So she gave birth to 6 different demigods. And this is just one example. There are many others. So now I will talk about a little bit about Ramayana. So in the main story of Ramayana is you had a king, he was called Dashrath, and he was tricked into sending Ram, his eldest son, into exile by his second wife, Kekeyi, so that her own son, Bharat, could sit on the throne. So Lord Ram went to exile dutifully, but his stepbrother Bharat refused to sit on the throne when he found out about his mother's tricks. He went to meet Lord Ram in the forest and begged him to come back, but Ram refused, saying that he had to keep his father's promise to his second wife. So Bharat, who was the half-brother of Lord Ram, returned with Ram's padukas or sandals. He put them on his head and he walked back to Ayodhya, which was the capital of that kingdom. And he put the sandals on the throne and he sat on a lower level himself because he did not consider himself to be the real king of Ayodhya. So this reminds me of the fact that the steward of Gondor could not sit on the throne of Gondor, but at a lower level than the throne, even though the stewards were ruling in place of the absent kings. So now my subheading is Strider and Lord Ram in the forest. So even though they were royalty, Ram, his wife Sita, and his half-brother Lakshman were his brother Lakshman were roaming in the forest in disguise. So this is reminiscent of Strider and the Rangers roaming Middle Earth in the wilderness, with none the wiser about Strider's true identity. Of course, Lord Ram helped various kings and other people in his wanderings in the wilderness, just like Strider helped various people as well. So Ram, Lakshman, and Sita used to find and eat roots, tubers, vegetables, berries, and fruits wherever they could find them in the forest. And Strider and the Rangers also became adept at foraging for food and surviving in the forest or in the wilderness. Then, of course, you have a lot of other heroes of the Tolkien universe, such as Turin, Hurin, Tuor, Huor, and various Baron, who were also roaming in the wilderness at various points in their lives. So in the Mahabharat, which is the other great epic, the 5 brothers, Pandavas, who are the protagonists of the story, were sent to exile for 13 years in the forest as well. Okay, wow, time really goes fast. So there are just 5 minutes left. Okay, I can quickly talk about Sita's abduction in the Ramayana. So Sita was abducted by the antagonist, who is Ravana, and taken south to his palace. So in Tolkien's works as well, many elvish ladies were abducted by Sauron's forces, which could include Arwen's mother, Celebrian. I don't really know how to pronounce her name. She was captured by the orcs and tortured by them. But somehow she managed to escape Sauron's servants and then left for the Undying Lands. So Sita resisted Ravana's advances and remained in the palace gardens outside. She never went inside. So in one version of Lúthien's story, she was imprisoned by Tevildo, an earlier version of Sauron, but she managed to escape from there. In another version, when Lúthien was going to rescue Beren, she was tricked by Caligrom, who took her hostage and wanted to marry her against her will. But Huan, the Hound of Valinor, helped her to escape from his clutches. So to come back to Sita's story in the Ramayana, she was discovered by Hanuman, the monkey god, and this god is still worshipped in India today. But she refused to go with him and said she would only leave if her husband Ram came and rescued her, which he managed to do in the end. So I will quickly talk about the eagles. So in the Ramayana, you have Jatayu, a vulture, who tried to rescue Sita, but he was mortally wounded. Then later on, Hanuman, the monkey god, learned from a vulture named Sampati, who was the elder brother of Jatayu, that Sita had been taken to Lanka. So this is reminiscent of the important role that the eagles played in the whole Middle Earth saga in the First Age, Second Age, and Third Age. For example, they rescued Bilbo and the dwarves in The Hobbit, and then later Frodo and Sam from Mount Doom. Then, of course, we have many thousands of elephants in the Ramayana and the Mahabharat, and we have elephants in the Pelennor Fields, for example, in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Very quickly, now we have destruction by fire. So at the end of the story, Ravana's kingdom was torched, Lanka was torched, destroyed by fire. And then Mordor also got destroyed by fire in the sense that the volcano erupted at Mount Doom. And then in India today, this is a continuous tradition for a few thousand years. In autumn, before the festival of Dashera, there's a 10-day enactment of the play of Ramayana, an abridged version. And at the end of these celebrations, a huge effigy of Ravana is made and it is burned down every year. And the symbolic significance of burning Ravan is of burning evil from this world and also within itself. So far, I've only been able to cover comparisons between the Ramayana and Tolkien's universe. I think the comparisons between Mahabharat and Tolkien's world will have to be another paper. So I don't know, Will, how many minutes do I have left now?
You have 1 minute.
Well, just to conclude, how can I conclude? So as I said, this is a non-exhaustive look at comparisons between the two Indian epics, in this case, just one Indian epic and Tolkien's universe. And these are just my interpretations of it. And please remember in your comments that these gods and deities are still worshipped in India, and therefore perhaps some people would find it offensive if I compared them to fictional immortal beings. However, there is at least one other paper in which a scholar called Pramudito Radhyanto Christianavati has compared the visions of characters of Devrata or Bhishma and Gandalf in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. So yeah, there are very, very few papers comparing the Indian epics and Tolkien's universe as far as I'm aware. If you have any other tips, please feel free to send them to me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sultana. And I remember seeing your paper as well in the Tolkien the Pagan conference in 2018. So it's wonderful to hear your new updated thoughts and reflections as well on the connections between Indian culture and mythology and Tolkien. So thank you very much for kicking off our the second part of today's seminar. So we're going to dive in. We've got some questions as well. So our first question asks, do you think some of the seeming Indian influence is a product of exoticism, like in media, like Star Wars, which uses uncredited aspects of varying Asian cultures to create an alien/foreign feeling? Or do you think it might be more a product of a man well-versed in mythology, including concepts, perhaps unconsciously?
Okay, so I'll interpret the question. I suppose the man refers to Tolkien here. I think I've already answered it. I don't know to what extent he was really consciously using Indian myths. But as I said, there are many, many common elements and factors and plot points and stories between many myths of the world. So obviously he was influenced by myths of Western Europe. And therefore, maybe through a process of osmosis, certain elements would creep into his own fictional myth making as well. But I don't think it was a conscious process.
Okay, thank you. And kind of jumping on top of that as well, someone would like to ask, you mentioned connotations between Rama and Iluvata and Vishnu and Manwi. Are there other similarities to other members of the Valar?
So just to be clear, I mentioned, I mean, I know these Indian names must be confusing for many people. So I mentioned connotations between Brahma and Iluvatar. So Brahma is the chief god of the Indian Trinity. And yeah, and Rama actually was an incarnation of Vishnu on earth. So yeah, and I did mention Vishnu's similarity to Manwe in the sense. So in fact, I did not read the whole part about Manwe because the word Man, M-A-N, in India means mind, but it also means man. Mm-hmm. The first man was Manu, who started the whole, he was also a Noah-like figure and he started the whole line of man. But Man is also mind and thought. And Manwe was always he explored the future with his thoughts. His thoughts were very strong. He would think that was his power. So I do see a connection between that, yes.
Super, thank you. Oh, where's that gone? I just had a question. Here we go. Okay, so our next question is, do you know if the translations, for example, into Hindi, use Hindu vocabulary for the gods? So, for example, for the Vala, the Diva.
I searched for Hindi translations when we did the Tolkien Day readings, and I couldn't find one. So in fact, I translated portions of texts of Tolkien into Hindi myself and I recorded them. If you can find any translations of Tolkien's works into Hindi, please feel free to let me know. Yeah, Sonali says there are no Hindi translations. Thank you, Sonali.
Well, fingers crossed, maybe we have one soon in that case.
Well, a lot of people in India read in English, so I don't know when that will come. Yeah. And there's no shortage of myths and stories in India either.
This is true. Okay. Okay, so what do you think about the nature of ages in The Lord of the Rings? Is it like the cyclical yugs in Indic religion, or of a more linear nature?
Well, yeah, one can draw comparisons between the first age, second age, and third age in the Tolkien's universe. And there are 4 ages in Indian mythology. But let's not forget that also in the Greco-Roman mythology, you have the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Golden Men, the Silver Men, the Bronze Men, the Iron Men. So yeah, that is a common factor in most myths. Is it of a linear nature? Well, who knows? I mean, nobody has lived through the 3 ages to know whether they are of a linear nature or not.
Okay, it's interesting to kind of think as well that that idea, obviously mythologies do sometimes share those connections. So that idea of like the 4 ages connecting multiple mythologies as well. So we can start to see how these resonances actually apply as well. Thank you. I missed out another. Where's that question gone? What's going on? Okay. So another question asked, this might not be so pertinent to the specifics that you are discussing, but this questioner has been considering the idea that Mughal period India could be a very good analogue to Gondor. Great development in astrology, medicine, and social change etc. Not to mention the Taj Mahal seems really alike to their image of Minas Tirith's white domed cities. The questioner was wondering if maybe you had any opinions on these ideas.
I think that's a very interesting comparison. I personally haven't given it a great deal of thought, but in fact, yeah, there could be. In fact, in India, we have a place called Fatehpur Sikri, which is not too far from the city of Agra, where you have the famous monument Taj Mahal. And this city was actually built by the Mughal emperors. It's on top of a hill. It's made of red sandstone, and now it's completely deserted. It's very beautiful to visit if you ever visit India. But yes, there are certain. But the Mughal Empire was really huge. It was bigger than the present day territory of India, I think. At one point, it stretched from Burma to what is now Pakistan. So yeah, so Gondor was perhaps not as huge, obviously, but yeah, in terms of the flourishing of culture, yes, I would say yes.